What if the future of a royal dynasty could be shaken not by war, not by politics, but by a single piece of paper locked inside a private file? That's the question setting the internet on fire right now. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because, just minutes ago, at least according to a wave of fast-moving reports and royal watchers, something happened behind palace walls that nobody expected. No balcony appearance, no formal statement, no smiling photo op, just quiet movement, legal movement, financial movement. And when royals move quietly, it usually means something very loud is happening behind the scenes. Here's what has people stunned. Whispers of a sudden inheritance freeze tied to Prince Harry's side of the family. Not a delay. Not routine paperwork. A freeze. The kind of word that doesn't get used unless advisors, lawyers, and senior figures are deeply, deeply concerned. But concerned about what? That's where the story turns from surprising to explosive. Because alongside talk of money and legacy, another rumor began circulating. One involving a private family matter that was never meant for public discussion. A matter so sensitive, so personal, that even longtime royal correspondents are choosing their words very carefully. Some are calling it a verification issue. Others say it involves lineage clarification. A few tabloids have gone further, hinting at DNA conversations happening far away from cameras and palace gates. Important to say, none of this has been officially confirmed. The palace hasn't released a statement. Harry and Meghan hadn't addressed it. But the timing, the legal undertones, and the sudden financial decisions, those are real enough to make people ask serious questions. And here's the biggest one. Why now? Think about it. Years have passed since Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties. They'd built a new life overseas. Media storms came and went. Interviews were given. Books were written. Accusations flew in every direction. If there were lingering doubts or unresolved tensions, why would something trigger action at this exact moment? That's what makes this different. This doesn't feel like gossip. It feels procedural, structured. Like professionals in suits sitting at polished tables saying, "We need to address this before it becomes bigger." And when procedure enters the picture, emotion usually follows. Because this isn't just about headlines. This is about family. Brothers. A father. Children growing up under the heaviest spotlight on earth. The British monarchy isn't just an institution. It's a bloodline built on tradition, image, and continuity. Fair or not, history shows that questions about lineage have shaken thrones before. Medieval kings went to war over it. Entire branches of royal families were erased over doubts and disputes. So when modern whispers echo ancient fears, people pay attention. Now, let's talk about Prince William for a second. The future king. The man raised from birth to think not just like a brother, but like a guardian of the crown's stability. If reports are true that he played some role, directly or indirectly, in pushing for financial caution, it puts him in an impossible position. Do you protect your brother's feelings? Or do you protect the institution you're destined to lead? That's not a tabloid dilemma. That's a Shakespearean one. And here's where the emotional weight really hits. Harry has always spoken about feeling like the spare, the outsider, the one who didn't fit neatly into the royal mold. His marriage, his move abroad, his interviews. All of it painted a picture of a man trying to define himself outside the system. But no matter how far you move, blood ties have a way of pulling you back into the storm. Imagine being him right now, watching speculation spread across screens worldwide. Not just about your role, your decisions, your past, but about your child. About your family's most private reality being debated by strangers. Is this protection? Is it suspicion? Is it simply legal caution blown out of proportion by a hungry media cycle? That uncertainty is exactly why this story has exploded. Because humans are wired to react to three things: family drama, power struggles, and secrets. This story has all three. A royal inheritance, symbol of legacy and status. A private question, symbol of trust and identity. And a silent palace, which historically has always meant more is happening than we're being told. But let's slow down for a second. What do we actually know for sure? We know the royal family has complex financial structures, involving trusts, inheritances, and conditions tied to lineage and legal definitions. We know that when questions, any questions, arise that could affect those structures, Advisors don't wait, they act first, clarify later. That doesn't automatically mean wrongdoing. It often means caution. But in the world of royalty, caution looks a lot like scandal. And scandal spreads faster than truth. So now, the public is left connecting dots. A quiet legal move here. A delayed engagement there. A cancelled appearance. A vague comment from an unnamed source. None of it definitive. All of it suspicious when placed side by side. And suspicion, once it enters the royal narrative, rarely leaves quietly. Here's the twist that makes this even more gripping. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, divorces, leaked phone calls, tell-all books. But the one thing it always fiercely protects is the clarity of the line. Who belongs where, who stands in line for what, and why. If that clarity is ever questioned, even privately, the reaction is swift and strategic. Which brings us back to that original shocking idea. Could a private family verification really trigger a move that looks this big from the outside? Or are we watching a misunderstanding spiral into the biggest royal rumor in years? That's the tension gripping this story. Two possible realities. One quiet and procedural. The other explosive and deeply personal. And right now the world doesn't know which one is true, but what insiders suggest happened next inside palace discussions is what truly turned a private concern into a potential royal turning point. And that part, almost no one saw coming. So, what exactly was said in those private rooms that turned quiet concern into urgent action? That's the question royal watchers can't stop asking. Because according to multiple palace-adjacent commentators, the shift wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic shouting or family confrontation. It was colder than that. More calculated, more official. It was a meeting, not the kind with cameras outside the gates. Not the kind added to the court circular. This was the kind where phones stay outside, legal folders stay closed until everyone is seated. And every word is chosen carefully because history might look back on it later. And here's what makes it gripping. The reported discussion wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as protection. Protection of what, though? A person? A title? A legacy? Let's rewind for a second. Royal inheritances aren't like ordinary family wills. They are often layered, conditional, and tied to legal definitions that go back generations. Some funds are personal. Others are linked to lineage, status, and constitutional expectations. That means, when even a whisper of uncertainty appears, advisors don't treat it like gossip. They treat it like risk, and institutions hate risk. Imagine sitting at that table. Senior aides, legal experts, financial stewards, perhaps a representative for the Prince of Wales's household. The atmosphere wouldn't be explosive. It would be tense in a quieter way, the kind where people speak slowly, carefully, because one wrong interpretation could ripple across headlines worldwide. One reported phrase keeps surfacing in commentary: precautionary pause. Not accusation. Not conclusion. A pause. But let's be honest, when the royal family pauses something, the world assumes the worst. Because historically, pauses have come before major turning points, engagements delayed, announcements postponed, titles reconsidered. Every time the palace slows down, it's usually because something behind the scenes is moving very fast. Now here's where Prince William's name enters the conversation, in a way that feels less like brotherly drama, and more like future king responsibility. William's role, according to royal analysts, isn't just to be a sibling. It's to be a stabilizer. From the moment he was born, his life has been structured around one idea: continuity. The monarchy must appear steady, predictable, and above personal chaos. So, when advisors raise even a theoretical question that could affect long-term perception, the future king can't just shrug it off. But think about the emotional contradiction there. This is the same brother he walked behind his mother's coffin with, the same brother he shared dorm rooms with at Eton, the same brother he stood beside on balconies, smiling for crowds who believed in the fairy tale image of royal unity. And now he's reportedly sitting in rooms where conversations are less about memories and more about legal clarity. That shift alone is heartbreaking, no matter where you stand on the Sussex debate. But here's something that rarely gets discussed. Doing nothing can be riskier than doing something. From an institutional point of view, failing to address a question, even a painful one, can look like negligence later. So sometimes action is taken not because guilt is assumed, but because uncertainty exists. Still, perception doesn't work that way, does it? To the public, a financial freeze sounds like judgment. It sounds like a verdict without a trial. And that's why this story feels so explosive. Because even if the intention was caution, the optics are dramatic. And optics are everything in royalty. Let's talk timing again because this part is strange. Why would discussions reach this level now, after years of distance between Harry and the core royal structure? Some commentators suggest it could be tied to upcoming long-term estate planning. Others believe it may relate to legal housekeeping as the monarchy transitions further into William's future reign. When big transitions approach, loose ends get examined, even ones people hoped would stay buried. But here's a human question for you. If you were told there was even a small administrative uncertainty tied to your family's future, would you want it clarified quietly now, or risk it becoming a public scandal later? That's the dilemma insiders say hovered over the table. And while all this was reportedly unfolding in polished rooms with heavy curtains and quiet voices, across the ocean, Harry and Meghan were living a very different reality. School runs, projects, public appearances, a life deliberately built outside palace walls. The contrast is striking. One world is legal procedure and legacy planning, the other is personal identity and independence. And right in the middle of those two worlds sits a child who never asked to be part of a global narrative. That's what adds emotional weight to this story. Because regardless of what is rumor, what is precaution, and what is fact, the situation touches something deeply human, the longing. Where do you come from? Who claims you? Who protects you when questions swirl that you're too young to understand? Those questions are bigger than royalty, they're universal. Which is why this situation, even in speculation form, feels so intense. Now, here's another twist. Several royal historians have pointed out that the monarchy has faced lineage whispers before. Not necessarily proven, not always true, but disruptive enough that legal and institutional safeguards were quietly reviewed. Most of those moments never became public scandals. They were handled behind the scenes, resolved, and sealed away in archives. But we live in a different era now. An era of social media, leaks, podcasts, documentaries. Secrets don't stay secret long. Even precautionary reviews can be misinterpreted as explosive revelations once fragments reach the public. So we're left in this strange space where a possible administrative safeguard is being interpreted as a dramatic family rupture. Is it one? Is it the other? Or is the truth somewhere painfully in between? And here's the part that insiders say truly changed the tone of those palace discussions. The moment when the conversation reportedly shifted from wait and see to we have to act now, because a single new development, quiet, technical but significant, entered the picture. And once it did, hesitation was no longer an option. What if the most explosive part of this entire story was never meant to leave a private room? Because according to the swirl of commentary now surrounding the situation, the turning point wasn't a shouting match, a leaked argument, or a dramatic confrontation. It was something far quieter, clinical, controlled. The kind of process that usually stays buried under confidentiality agreements and legal protocol. A private verification. Now, let's slow down and be clear. There is no official confirmation of any specific test, result, or conclusion. None. But what royal analysts and media commentators are circling around is the idea that at some point, a question was raised that required formal clarification behind the scenes. Not for headlines. Not for drama. For records. For legal precision. For institutional certainty. And in a family where bloodlines have shaped history for 1,000 years, even the suggestion of a need for clarification is enough to send shockwaves. Here's why. Most families, when faced with personal uncertainty, handle it emotionally. Conversations, arguments, reassurances. But royal families, they handle uncertainty procedurally, through advisors, through documentation, through steps designed to remove doubt rather than debate it. That difference changes everything. Imagine being told that something deeply personal might need formal confirmation. Not because someone is accusing, not because love is absent, but because systems, trusts, and centuries-old structures demand clarity. It sounds cold, it feels impersonal. But institutions operate differently than families. and the monarchy is both. That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. A family bound by emotion, trapped inside an institution bound by rules. So when whispers began suggesting that a private matter had quietly moved into a legal or administrative space, insiders say the tone shifted instantly. No more, let's not speculate. No more, this will pass. Instead it became, if this question exists at all, it must be addressed properly, discreetly, and definitively. Because unresolved questions are dangerous in royal history. Think back centuries. Succession disputes. Hidden heirs. Questions of legitimacy. Entire wars were fought over uncertainty. The modern monarchy may be symbolic now, but its internal systems are still built to prevent even the appearance of instability. That's why even a whisper can trigger a process. Now here's where things get emotionally complicated. To the public, the idea of a verification sounds accusatory. It feels like doubt, like mistrust. But to legal minds, verification can simply mean documentation catching up with reality. Procedures that ensure records match truth. It doesn't always imply wrongdoing. Sometimes it's just bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does best. Making sure every box is ticked. But tell that to social media. Once the word DNA started appearing in speculative headlines and commentary threads, the story took on a life of its own. Suddenly, strangers online were debating the most private aspects of a child's identity. People who have never met the family were speaking with certainty about matters they have no access to. And that's where this story shifts from institutional tension to human pain. Because no matter what is rumor and what is reality, there are real people at the center of this. A father, a mother, a child growing up in a world where his name trends before he can even read. Imagine being Prince Harry in this moment. A man who has spoken openly about protecting his family from media intrusion. A man who left the royal system partly to escape relentless scrutiny. And now, the most private kind of speculation imaginable is circling globally. Is this the kind of situation he feared all along? Or is this a misunderstanding spiraling beyond control? That's the question many royal observers are now asking. Here's another layer most people don't think about. If any kind of formal clarification process did occur, it likely would have been handled with extreme confidentiality. Laboratories, if involved, operate under strict privacy laws. Legal reviews happen behind closed doors. Results, if they exist, would be shared with a tiny circle bound by professional secrecy, which means the public would never be meant to know. So how do whispers escape? Sometimes it's not a leak of facts. Sometimes it's a leak of reaction. A cancelled meeting. A sudden legal adjustment. A shift in tone. Observers notice movement and try to reverse engineer the cause. That's how speculation grows roots. And once it does, it spreads fast. But here's a thought worth considering. What if the process wasn't driven by suspicion at all, but by protection? Protection against future legal disputes. Protection against misinformation. Protection against a scenario where unanswered questions could be weaponized years from now. From that perspective, clarification isn't an attack. It's a shield. Still, shields can feel like swords when you're the one being examined. And this is where the emotional stakes rise again. Meghan, already one of the most scrutinized figures in the world, now finds herself at the center of a narrative she hasn't addressed, and may never want to. Fair or unfair, public focus often gravitates toward her in any royal controversy. That adds pressure. Intense pressure. But what if she sees this not as doubt, but as intrusion? And what about Harry? A father first. A prince second. If he feels his child's privacy is being invaded under the banner of protocol, does that deepen the divide between him and the institution he was born into? You can see how quickly this shifts from paperwork to heartbreak. Because beneath the legal language and cautious phrases are very real emotions. Fear of betrayal, fear of misunderstanding, fear of history repeating itself in a family that has already endured so much public pain. And yet, from the palace perspective, ignoring a formal question might feel equally dangerous. If something surfaces later that appears to have been overlooked, the criticism would be brutal. Why didn't they check? Why didn't they clarify? Why did they leave room for doubt? So they're trapped between two impossible outcomes: act and seem cold, or don't act and seem careless. That's the royal dilemma in a nutshell. But here's the twist that insiders say changed everything. The moment when quiet verification talk reportedly turned into a broader institutional conversation involving not just advisors, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. Because once this issue touched legacy planning, it stopped being a private family matter and started becoming a constitutional consideration. And that's when Prince William's role reportedly became impossible to avoid. Was this the moment William stopped being just a brother and started acting fully as a future king? Because once the issue reportedly moved beyond private clarification and into long-term legacy planning, the emotional lines blurred with constitutional ones. And that's where Prince William's position becomes not just relevant, but central. Think about the life William has been raised for. Every step, every speech, every handshake has been preparing him for one role: guardian of continuity. Not celebrity, not influencer, custodian. His job isn't just to lead, it's to preserve stability in a system that survives on predictability and public trust. So when advisors allegedly placed a sensitive question on the table, one that could even theoretically affect perceptions of lineage and inheritance structures, ignoring it wasn't really an option, even if it hurt, even if it felt personal, even if it meant being seen as the bad guy. Because future kings don't get to choose the easy path. They get handed the necessary one. But here's the part that makes this so emotionally complicated. William isn't just a symbol. He's a man with memories. A man who once shared inside jokes with Harry at family barbecues. A man who stood shoulder to shoulder with his brother during some of the hardest moments of their young lives. And now, according to royal commentators, he may have been sitting in meetings where the conversation was no longer about feelings, but about files. Imagine the internal conflict. One side of him hears Diana's voice reminding him to protect his brother. The other hears the quiet, steady expectation of the crown saying, protect the institution first. Which voice do you listen to when history is watching? That's the question. At the heart of this chapter. Sources close to royal reporting circles suggest William's involvement, if it existed, would not have looked dramatic. No ultimatums, no public gestures. Instead, it would have been procedural. Listening to advisors, asking careful questions, weighing long-term consequences. The kind of leadership style he's been known for. Measured, cautious, sometimes frustratingly silent. Silence can look cold from the outside. But inside palace walls, silence often means strategy. Still, perception is everything, and to many watching from afar, any action connected to Harry's side of the family feels like escalation. Like another brick in the wall between two brothers who once seemed inseparable. Here's where the contradiction gets sharp. If William did nothing, critics might later say he was negligent, that he ignored a potential issue that could have affected the monarchy's credibility. If he supported precautionary steps, critics say he's heartless, choosing crown over kin. There is no winning move, only the least damaging one. And that pressure has been building for years. Ever since Harry and Meghan stepped back, William's path has grown narrower. He doesn't have the freedom to speak openly. He doesn't have the luxury of emotional interviews. His role demands restraint. Even when his personal world is anything but calm, that restraint can be misunderstood as indifference, but insiders often describe it differently, as containment, keeping storms from reaching the surface. But what happens when the storm is already global? Let's talk about optics again. A reported inheritance freeze tied, even loosely, to Harry's branch of the family sends a powerful message, whether intended or not. It says the monarchy is tightening its internal structures. It says caution is overriding sentiment. And if William is seen as part of that decision-making chain, it subtly signals how his reign might operate in the future. Less emotional, more structured, more focused on long-term institutional survival than short-term family harmony. Some would call that responsible. Others would call it tragic. And what about Harry's perspective? Imagine watching your older brother, once your closest ally, become the face of decisions that feel like they're aimed at your family. Even if he believes he's acting out of duty, the emotional fallout could be enormous. Because in families, intent doesn't erase impact. Maybe William sees this as safeguarding the future for all royal children, including Harry's. Maybe Harry sees it as a sign that trust is gone. Both perspectives could exist at the same time. Both could feel justified. And that's what makes this story so painfully human beneath all the royal formality. Now here's a detail that royal historians keep bringing up. Every monarch-to-be faces a moment where personal relationships collide with institutional duty. For Queen Elizabeth, it was her sister Margaret's marriage. For King Charles, it was the breakdown of his own. For William, this may be one of those defining crossroads. A moment where history quietly asks, who are you when family and crown pull in opposite directions? And there's another layer most people overlook. William isn't acting in a vacuum. He's influenced by advisors, by lessons from the past, by the knowledge that the monarchy's survival in the modern world depends on avoiding ambiguity. In today's media climate, even the appearance of uncertainty can spiral into a credibility crisis. So caution becomes policy. Still, policy doesn't mend broken trust. If Harry interprets these moves as a lack of faith in him or his family, the emotional distance could widen permanently. And that distance wouldn't just be between brothers. It would echo through the next generation. Cousins growing up worlds apart, shared childhood memories replaced with separate narratives. That's the quiet tragedy hidden inside all this institutional language. And here's the twist: insiders say truly complicated William's position. Once legal advisors outlined the potential long-term implications of leaving questions unresolved, the decision reportedly stopped being about today's headlines and started being about decades from now, about future historians, future legal interpretations, future reigns. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Harry. It was about the monarchy William will one day lead. And when your entire life has been preparation for that role, stepping back isn't really an option. But what happened when the legal side of the situation was laid out in full, when the financial structures, trusts, and constitutional mechanics were explained in detail? That's when the conversation reportedly shifted from emotional tension to hard legal reality. And once that door opened, there was no going back. What happens when centuries of tradition collide with modern legal reality? That's where this story reportedly moved next. Away from emotion, away from family tension, and straight into the world of legal frameworks, trust structures, and constitutional mechanics most people never see. Because royal wealth isn't just sitting in a vault with a name tag on it. It's layered, compartmentalized, protected by systems designed long before any of the current players were born. And once advisors begin reviewing those systems, everything becomes less about feelings and more about definitions. Legal definitions. Here's something most people don't realize. In royal and aristocratic structures, inheritance isn't always automatic in the way it is for ordinary families. Some assets are personal. Others are tied to status, role, and formal recognition within the institution. Certain trusts are governed by rules that require documentation, verification, and absolute clarity about who qualifies under specific terms. Not because someone is in trouble, but because ambiguity can create legal chaos decades later. Imagine a future dispute, years from now, where lawyers ask, was this ever formally clarified? If the answer is no, the institution looks careless. If the answer is yes, even if it was uncomfortable at the time, the system looks stable. That's the lens legal advisors use. Not gossip, not emotion, risk management. And once that lens is applied, the tone of any discussion changes instantly. Reportedly, this is when the phrase fiduciary responsibility entered the picture. That's a heavy term. It means decision makers are legally obligated to act in the best long-term interest of the institution, even if it creates short-term discomfort. It's the same principle that governs major foundations, estates, and historical trusts around the world. So, if advisors raised even a hypothetical question about documentation or classification within inheritance structures, their duty wouldn't be to ignore it. Their duty would be to pause, review, and make sure everything aligns legally. Notice what's missing there? Accusation, drama, personal judgment. But here's the problem. The public doesn't speak legal. The public speaks emotion. To outside observers, a review looks like suspicion. A pause looks like punishment. A freeze sounds like a verdict. But in legal environments, those words often mean something much less theatrical and much more procedural. Still, perception shapes reality, especially in royal life. And once whispers began connecting legal caution with personal narratives, the story took on a life of its own. Suddenly, centuries-old inheritance mechanisms were being interpreted through the lens of modern celebrity culture, where every move is seen as a statement. But here's a key contradiction. The monarchy survives by being slow and careful, while the internet thrives on being fast and emotional. That clash is fueling this entire firestorm. Let's talk about trusts for a moment. Many royal-related assets are held in structures designed to preserve wealth across generations while preventing sudden disruptions. These trusts often contain clauses about eligibility, stewardship, and oversight. When major family changes happen, marriages, relocations, shifts in working royal status, those structures are sometimes reviewed to ensure everything still fits within the intended framework. That doesn't mean something is wrong. It means the system is adjusting to new realities. But adjustments behind palace walls look mysterious from the outside. And mystery invites speculation. Oh, now imagine being a legal advisor in that room. Your job is not to protect feelings. Your job is to protect the long-term integrity of structures that have existed longer than any individual life. You're thinking in decades, not days. In reigns, not news cycles. So when a sensitive topic intersects with inheritance law, you don't ask, will this cause headlines? You ask, if we don't address this now, what could happen in 30 years? That future-focused mindset can feel brutally impersonal, especially to family members who experience the situation as something deeply human. Here's where the emotional undercurrent resurfaces. For Harry, who has consistently framed his journey as choosing family over institution, the idea of legal mechanisms shaping personal narratives might feel like exactly what he tried to escape. Cold systems, formal rules, decisions made in quiet rooms without his voice at the center. For William, raised to see those systems as necessary for stability, the same process might feel like responsible stewardship. Same event. Two completely different emotional realities. Oh, that's the tragedy inside the procedure. And here's something else rarely discussed. Once legal reviews begin, they often trigger secondary reviews, not because new problems appear, but because systems are interconnected. Adjusting one part means checking others. It becomes a domino effect of due diligence. From the outside, that looks like escalation. Inside, it's standard practice. But standard practice has never stopped a royal story from feeling dramatic, especially when the topic touches on identity, legacy, and the future of a bloodline watched by millions. Now, as advisors reportedly mapped out possible scenarios, best case, worst case, everything in between, one thing became clear: leaving uncertainty unaddressed would carry its own risks, legal risks, reputational risks, historical risks. And when institutions built on tradition sense risk, they tighten. That tightening is what many observers are now interpreting as a freeze, a hold, a moment of institutional stillness while the paperwork catches up with reality. But paperwork doesn't make headlines. Emotion does. So while legal teams think in clauses and contingencies, the world thinks in betrayal and bombshells. And right at the center of that emotional storm stands Meghan. A figure who, fairly or unfairly, has become the focal point of nearly every royal controversy of the past several years. But what does it feel like to be the person everyone assumes is at the center of something you haven't publicly spoken about? That's where the story turns from legal mechanics, back to human impact. Because while institutions can afford to be clinical, individuals feel every ripple personally. And insiders say the emotional toll of this situation, not the legal one, may be what ultimately shapes what happens next. Why does the spotlight always seem to swing back to Meghan no matter where the story starts? That's the uncomfortable question sitting at the center of this chapter. Because even when discussions are about legal structures, institutional safeguards, or royal protocol, public attention has a way of narrowing until it focuses on one person, one face, one narrative. And in this story, that person is Meghan. Fair or not, deserved or not, she has become the lightning rod for every royal controversy connected to Harry's departure from the monarchy. So when whispers of private verifications and inheritance reviews began circulating, it didn't take long for online speculation to frame her as the central figure in a drama she hasn't publicly addressed. Imagine what that feels like. To wake up and see your name trending alongside words like DNA, inheritance, and royal crisis. To know that strangers are debating the most personal aspects of your family life as if it were a scripted TV show. To feel the weight of global opinion without the ability, or perhaps the desire, to respond to every rumor. That's not just pressure. That's isolation on a scale most people can't comprehend. Here's the contradiction that makes Meghan's position so complex. On one hand, she chose a life with one of the most famous families in the world. Public scrutiny comes with that territory. On the other hand, no one signs up for speculation about their children's identity becoming a global talking point. Where's the line between public interest and personal intrusion? That question doesn't have an easy answer. But it sits right at the heart of this moment. From the palace perspective, any legal or institutional review would be framed as procedure, not personal judgment. But from Meghan's perspective, the distinction may not feel so clear. If systems are being examined in ways that indirectly touch her family, it can feel like being investigated rather than protected. And perception, again, shapes emotional reality. Over the past few years, Meghan has often been portrayed in extremes, either as a disruptive outsider or as a woman unfairly targeted by an unyielding institution. Rarely is there space in the middle for nuance. Rarely is she allowed to simply be a person navigating an extraordinary situation. So when this new wave of speculation hit, those old narratives came rushing back. Critics saying, "See, this proves something was wrong." Supporters saying, "This is another example of the system trying to control the story." Both sides convinced, neither side with confirmed facts. And right in the middle of that noise is a family trying to live a life far away from palace corridors. Think about the emotional layers here. Meghan as a mother, Meghan as a wife, Meghan as a public figure who has already spoken about mental health struggles under intense media pressure. Now add a fresh wave of deeply personal speculation to that mix. How do you stay steady when the world feels like it's dissecting your life in real time? Some observers believe the situation, more than any before it, could harden Meghan and Harry's resolve to keep distance from royal structures, because if even private family matters become entangled with institutional procedure, it reinforces the idea that separation was necessary for peace. But others argue the opposite, that moments like this could eventually force some kind of private reconciliation, simply because the emotional stakes are too high to leave unresolved forever. Which outcome feels more likely to you? That's the tension building quietly behind all the headlines. Here's another layer. Meghan has often been described as someone who values narrative control. Podcasts, documentaries, interviews, platforms where she and Harry can tell their story in their own words. But this situation, whatever its true details, is unfolding in a space where control is almost impossible. Legal confidentiality on one side, media speculation on the other. That loss of control can feel suffocating. Because when you can't respond directly, silence gets filled by other people's assumptions. And assumptions are rarely kind. Yet there's also the possibility that Meghan sees this entire storm as proof of why stepping back was the right decision. If life inside the royal system means personal matters can trigger institutional reviews, then building an independent identity outside that system becomes not just a preference, but a form of protection. Still, protection comes with trade-offs. Distance can create safety, but it can also deepen divides. And if this situation is widening the emotional gap between Harry and his brother, Meghan may find herself carrying guilt for a fracture she never intended to cause. That's the quiet emotional burden rarely discussed. Publicly, this looks like palace drama. Privately, it may feel like watching your husband struggle with loyalty to the family he was born into, and loyalty to the family he built with you. No headlines capture that tension. Now here's where things get even more complicated. Some royal commentators suggest that Meghan's role in this narrative might be more symbolic than factual, that she represents change, modernity, independence, challenge to tradition. And so any institutional tightening gets subconsciously linked to her presence, even if the procedures are broader and more structural. In other words, she becomes the face of a clash between old systems and new realities. That's a heavy role for any one person to carry, and yet, whether she wants it or not, the spotlight is on her again. But here's the twist insiders hint at. While public focus is fixed on Meghan, the most emotionally intense struggle may actually be happening inside Harry himself, because while Meghan faces external pressure, Harry may be facing an internal storm, torn between defending his family and confronting the weight of royal expectations that never fully disappear. And if that's true, the next chapter of this story isn't about institutions or optics. It's about a father, a son, a prince, who may be standing at the most personal crossroads of his life. What does a father do when the world starts whispering about his child? That's the question hanging over Prince Harry right now. Not as a royal, not as a public figure, but as a dad. Because strip away the titles, the protocols, the centuries of tradition. And what you have is a man who has spoken again and again about one thing above all else: protecting his family. Protecting them from the kind of relentless scrutiny that shaped his own childhood. Protecting them from the cameras, the speculation, the feeling of being watched at every moment. And now, despite building a life thousands of miles away from palace walls, the noise has followed him. Imagine the emotional collision happening behind closed doors. On one side, Harry the father, whose instinct is to shield his child from harm. Emotional, psychological, public. On the other, Harry the prince, born into a system where personal identity has always been intertwined with institutional expectation. Those two roles were always going to clash eventually, but few imagined it would look like this. Harry has always been the royal who wore his heart on his sleeve. From his military service to his mental health advocacy, he has spoken openly about pain, loss, and the scars left by growing up in the public eye. He knows firsthand what it feels like to have your life debated by strangers. So if speculation is now touching his child, the emotional stakes for him aren't abstract. They're visceral. This isn't just a headline. It's history threatening to repeat itself. And that may be why his silence right now feels so loud, because Harry is not someone who stays quiet easily. When he believes something is unfair or harmful, he tends to speak out. Interviews, statements, documentaries. He has never shied away from telling his side of the story. But this situation is different. Why? Because speaking could make it worse. Addressing rumors can amplify them. Denying speculation can turn private matters into permanent public records. Staying silent can feel unbearable. But sometimes it's the only way to protect a child from a news cycle that feeds on reaction. So Harry may be trapped in the hardest position of all, feeling the urge to defend but knowing that defense could fuel the fire. That kind of restraint doesn't come without emotional cost. And then there's the layer of trust. If institutional processes are unfolding back in the UK, legal reviews, inheritance pauses, quiet consultations, Harry might feel decisions are being made about his family without his full participation. Even if those processes are procedural, not personal, the emotional experience could feel like exclusion. Like being talked about instead of talked to. For someone who has already described feeling like the spare, like the outsider within his own family, that sensation could reopen old wounds. But here's the contradiction that makes this even more painful. The same system he may feel pushed out by is also the one trying to protect its own long-term stability. From their perspective, caution is responsibility. From his perspective, it may feel like mistrust. Both sides might believe they're doing the right thing. And that's what makes reconciliation so complicated. Let's not forget Harry's relationship with legacy itself. He has always had a complex connection to royal tradition. Proud of his heritage, yet critical of the system. Protective of his mother's memory, yet wary of the institution that, in his view, failed her. That tension has shaped nearly every major decision of his adult life. So when a situation arises that ties his child's future to the very structures he stepped away from, it forces a question he may have hoped never to face so directly. Can you ever truly leave the monarchy behind, when your bloodline is part of it forever? That's not just political. That's existential. And think about the emotional pressure at home. Meghan looking to him for reassurance. His children unaware of the storm swirling around their names. The weight of knowing that whatever he does next, speak out, stay silent, push back, step closer, could shape not just headlines, but relationships for decades. That's a heavy burden for anyone. Even a prince. Some royal observers believe this moment could harden Harry's resolve to keep firm boundaries between his family and the institution. To double down on independence. To ensure that no future decisions about his children happen without his voice front and center. Others think the opposite. That the emotional gravity of the situation might eventually push him towards some form of private dialogue with his father and brother. Not for the cameras, not for the public, but for clarity, for peace, for the sake of the next generation. Which path do you think he's leaning toward? Because either direction carries consequences. Distance may bring safety, but it can also deepen isolation. Re-engagement may bring answers, but it could reopen old conflicts. There is no easy road forward, and while the world debates legalities and lineage, Harry may be wrestling with something far more personal. How to be the kind of father he wished he'd had during his own most vulnerable years. One who shields, one who listens, one who doesn't let the noise of the world define a child's sense of self. But even the most determined parent can't completely silence a global media storm. And that's why insiders say the next phase of this situation won't be driven by lawyers or advisors, but by a decision Harry himself may soon have to make, a decision about whether to stay silent or finally speak. And if he does speak, what he chooses to reveal or refuse to reveal could change the course of this entire story. What happens when children become symbols in a story they never chose to be part of? That's where this situation quietly shifts from royal intrigue to something far more human and far more uncomfortable, because while headlines focus on inheritance structures and institutional caution, the long-term impact touches the next generation most of all. In monarchies, children are never just children. They are future placeholders, living extensions of history. Their names get written into lines of succession before they can spell them. Their identities carry weight they don't yet understand. And when questions, even speculative ones, swirl around them, it's not just a family matter. It becomes a narrative about continuity itself. Well, that's why this moment feels bigger than a single legal review or inheritance pause. It's about how the monarchy defines belonging. In a modern world where family structures are more complex, more global, and more publicly scrutinized than ever before, for centuries, royal systems operated in near silence. If doubts or disputes arose, they were settled quietly, often with outcomes the public never fully understood. But today, every whisper leaks. Every pause is analyzed. Every child's place in the story becomes a topic for debate on social media threads and talk shows. That's a reality no royal generation before this one had to face. Imagine growing up and one day discovering that before you were old enough to tie your shoes, strangers were arguing online about your identity, about your place in a family, about what you represent. That's not just a loss of privacy. That's a loss of innocence, and it raises a bigger question for the monarchy itself. How do you protect children in an era where information moves faster than institutions can respond? Because the old strategy, say nothing, wait it out, doesn't always work anymore. Silence used to create mystery, now it creates speculation. And speculation can harden into belief before facts ever surface. So the institution faces a delicate balance. Move too quickly, and it looks reactive. Move too slowly, and it looks secretive. Either way, the children at the center of the story grow up in a shadow they didn't create. That's the emotional undercurrent rarely acknowledged in royal reporting. We talk about legacy like it's a crown or a title, but legacy is also emotional inheritance. The atmosphere a child grows up in, the stories they hear about themselves, the way their family history is framed before they're old enough to form their own identity. If this situation deepens divides within the royal family, those divides won't just exist between brothers, they'll ripple into the next generation. Cousins who might have grown up together instead knowing each other through headlines, shared holidays replaced by separate worlds. That's the quiet cost of unresolved tension. But here's the contradiction. The monarchy's survival depends on projecting unity and continuity, yet its internal challenges often revolve around the very human reality that families are complicated, imperfect, and sometimes fractured. In the past, distance between royal branches could be hidden by geography and limited media coverage. Today, distance is amplified. Every missed family event becomes a story. Every separate appearance becomes a signal. So, when institutional decisions intersect with personal narratives, the impact stretches far beyond the original issue. Now consider the long-term perspective advisors might be taking. They aren't just thinking about today's headlines. They're thinking about how history books will describe this generation. Whether future historians will say the monarchy adapted responsibly to modern challenges or stumbled through avoidable controversies. And central to that evaluation will be how the institution handled questions of identity, belonging, and fairness in an era where public trust is fragile, because trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. If the public perceives that children are being treated differently, or caught in adult conflicts, sympathy shifts quickly. And in a constitutional monarchy that depends on public goodwill more than political power, perception can be as important as protocol. That's why this moment feels like more than a family disagreement. It's a test of how an ancient institution navigates modern expectations about transparency, equality, and emotional intelligence. Can a system built on tradition evolve without losing its core identity? Or does every attempt to modernize risk exposing cracks that were once hidden? Those are the deeper questions swirling beneath the surface of this story. And then there's the personal side again. Harry and Meghan raising their children in a different country, trying to give them a sense of normalcy while their names remain tied to royal structures across the ocean. William and Catherine, raising future working royals under constant preparation for public roles, two branches of the same family, living vastly different childhood experiences. Well, how will those children understand each other when they grow up? Will they see each other as cousins separated by circumstance, or by choice? Moments like this shape those future relationships in ways no one can fully predict. And that's why insiders say the next phase of this story won't just be about legal clarity or institutional caution. It will be about communication, or the lack of it, about whether the adults involved can find a way to address tensions privately before they calcify into permanent distance. Because once narratives set in childhood harden, they're difficult to undo. But just when it seemed like this situation would remain a quiet institutional matter with long-term emotional consequences, a new question reportedly emerged inside palace discussions. Not about the past, about the future. And that question may determine whether this is remembered as a moment of fracture, or a turning point toward a very different kind of royal evolution. So where does this go from here? That's the question no palace insider, no commentator, and no royal watcher can answer with certainty right now. Because when a situation involves private family matters, institutional caution, and global media speculation all at once, the future doesn't move in a straight line, it branches, and each branch leads to a very different outcome. Let's start with the quietest possibility, the one that rarely makes headlines but often happens behind the scenes. Private clarification, private reassurance, private resolution. In this version of events, whatever questions triggered reviews or pauses are addressed discreetly. Documentation is aligned, and life moves forward without a single public statement spelling out the details. From the palace's point of view, this would be ideal. Stability preserved, drama contained. No fuel added to the media fire. But here's the catch. Silence doesn't always stop speculation anymore. In today's world, a lack of explanation can feel like confirmation to those already convinced something dramatic is happening. So, even if everything were settled privately, the public narrative might continue spinning on its own momentum. That's the risk of the digital age. Stories don't end when facts are resolved. They end when attention moves on. Now consider a second path. Controlled clarification. Not a full reveal. Not deeply personal details, but a carefully worded statement designed to calm public speculation without opening new doors, something along the lines of reaffirming family unity, confirming that matters are private and handled appropriately, and asking for space. It's the kind of approach institutions use when rumors grow loud enough that total silence starts to erode trust. But that option carries emotional weight too, because even a gentle statement can feel like an intrusion if it touches on personal family matters. It can draw a line between what is publicly acknowledged and what remains private. And once that line exists, it's hard to erase. Would Harry and Meghan welcome that kind of statement? Or would they see it as another example of the institution shaping a narrative about their family without full consent? That tension makes this path complicated. Then there's the third possibility. Continued distance. No joint messaging. No visible reconciliation. Legal and financial structures adjusted quietly where needed, while personal relationships remain strained. In this version, the monarchy and the Sussex family move forward on parallel tracks, connected by history but separated by day-to-day reality. This might be the most emotionally realistic scenario in the short term, because rebuilding trust takes time, and right now emotions on all sides may be too raw for quick repair. But distance has long-term consequences. For cousins growing up apart, for public perception of royal unity, for the emotional landscape of a family already shaped by loss and scrutiny. And here's where the story turns again, because the monarchy itself is entering a new era. King Charles's reign represents transition. William's future reign represents modernization under pressure. Every major family moment now gets viewed not just as personal drama, but as a preview of how the institution will function in decades to come. Will it lean toward transparency? Or double down on privacy? Will it prioritize emotional intelligence? Or procedural caution? Moments like this quietly shape those answers. Now think about public opinion. The monarchy survives not by force but by consent. People have to believe it represents continuity, fairness, and stability. If situations involving children and identity start to feel murky or emotionally harsh, public sympathy can shift quickly. And when sympathy shifts, so does the conversation about the monarchy's relevance in a modern society. That's why insiders say this situation isn't just a family issue, it's a reputational crossroads. Handle it with empathy and care, and the institution may emerge looking thoughtful and responsible. Handle it poorly, or appear to, and it could reinforce criticisms that the system is too rigid, too cold, too out of step with contemporary values. But here's the human side again. While commentators debate strategy, real people are living this in real time. Harry, weighing whether silence protects or harms. Meghan, navigating the emotional toll of renewed scrutiny. William, balancing duty with personal history. Charles, likely wishing for peace between his sons while also carrying the weight of the crown. Well, there are no villains in that emotional landscape. Only people shaped by different roles, different responsibilities, and different interpretations of what doing the right thing means. And sometimes, doing the right thing for an institution feels like the wrong thing for a relationship. So what happens next may depend less on legal paperwork and more on private conversations, the kind we will never see. Phone calls that aren't leaked, meetings that don't appear on official calendars. Moments where tone of voice matters more than titles. Reconciliation, if it comes, probably won't be dramatic. No grand public reunion. Or, more likely, a gradual softening. A willingness to listen. A shared recognition that the next generation deserves better than inherited tension. But that outcome requires something difficult from everyone involved. Trust rebuilt slowly, without cameras. And here's the final twist in all of this. The one few people are talking about yet. Whatever the truth behind the initial questions, whatever the legal reviews or precautionary steps, the lasting impact of this moment may not be about inheritance at all. It may be about whether this family, under the heaviest spotlight on earth, can find a way to redefine what unity looks like in a modern royal era. Because unity doesn't always mean living side by side. Sometimes it means agreeing on boundaries, respect, and protection for the youngest members of the family. Even when the adults disagree, the world is watching for scandal. But the real story may become one of evolution or fracture. And which of those paths becomes reality may depend on decisions being made right now, in rooms we'll never enter. What if the real story was never about documents, tests, or inheritances, but about what a family chooses to become under pressure? We started with a shocking possibility, a private question, a reported institutional reaction, a wave of speculation that turned a quiet internal matter into a global conversation. But after all the analysis, all the emotion, all the legal talk and royal history, we're left with something far more human than any headline, a family at a crossroads. Because whether every rumor is true, partly true, or completely misunderstood, the emotional reality is undeniable. Trust has been strained, distance has grown, and the next generation stands in the middle of a story they never asked to inherit. That's the part history will remember most, not the noise, not the trending hashtags, but how the people involved chose to move forward when the pressure was at its peak. The British monarchy has survived for centuries, not because it avoided crises, but because it adapted after them. Abdications, affairs, scandals, wars, public opinion shifts. Every generation faces a moment where the old rules no longer fit the new world. And every time, the institution either bends or risks breaking. This may be one of those moments, because today's public doesn't just care about titles and tradition. They care about fairness, about empathy, about how children are treated when adult conflicts make headlines. The monarchy's long-term survival depends as much on emotional intelligence now as it once did on ceremony. And that's why this story resonates so deeply. It touches on identity, belonging, protection, the universal instinct to shield your child from harm, strip away the crowns and castles. And those instincts are the same in every family on earth. So the question becomes, can an ancient institution built on protocol make space for modern emotional realities? Can brothers who once shared everything find a way to share understanding again, even if they never share the same path? Can parents on both sides agree that the youngest members of the family deserve distance from the storm? Those answers won't come from press releases. They won't come from commentators. They'll come from private decisions, quiet conversations, and time. Because time does something powerful in families. It softens sharp edges. It reframes anger as hurt. It turns us versus them into, how do we make this better for the children? And children have a way of changing everything. One day, the next generation will ask questions, not about rumors, but about relationships, about why cousins grew up apart, about why certain moments were tense, about what the adults did when things got hard, and the answers they receive will shape how they carry the family story forward. That's legacy, not just wealth or titles, but emotional inheritance. Right now, the world is watching for the next dramatic twist. A statement, a denial, a confrontation. But the most meaningful developments may happen quietly. A call returned, a boundary respected, a decision to handle something privately rather than publicly. Those moments don't trend, but they matter most, because in the end, the monarchy's future won't be decided by a single controversy. It will be decided by whether it can balance